My name is Lucetta Sims. I work at the Shasta Trinity as a botanist, and my co-chair couldn't make it here today, Julie Kierstead. I want to express my gratitude for her to help bring this topic to us today and help me organize the speakers. But she sends her regards, and in her stead, I was able to have Jason Brooks, a research associate from Cal Academy of Sciences, help out today. And before we begin, just take a moment to recognition and gratitude for the indigenous people's land that we are on today in San Jose, the Damian Nation, or Tamian, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, the Ahone, and the Mukwima. Our title for this session is Effects of Fire Suppression and Fuels Management on Rare Plants. And that encompasses a lot, but we have some great speakers going to be speaking with you guys today, and at the very end there'll be a casual, we'll have some chairs lined up here to ask some questions. If you didn't get a question in after a talk, there'll be room for that. We'll have some microphones to be passing around. So first up, we have Alan Kaufmann. Alan Kaufmann is the Director of Conservation Programs for Laguna Canyon Foundation, where he has worked for the last 8 years. He has a master's degree in forest ecology from Northern Arizona University and has worked in outdoor education and land management for his entire career. His talk is called A Different Kind of Fuel Modification, Balancing Fire Safety and Habitat. Come on.
Wow, there's a lot more of you than I thought there would be. Okay, let's see if I can figure this out here. So, Laguna Canyon Foundation is a small nonprofit. Our mission statement is to preserve, protect, enhance, and promote the 22,000-acre South Coast Wilderness, also known as the Laguna Greenbelt, and which is on the shared traditional unceded homelands of the Ahachiman and Tongva peoples. We're a small nonprofit. We've been around for over 30 years. We initially came into being to facilitate the transfer of land from private hands to public hands. And in the last dozen or so years, we've dramatically increased our programs into advocacy, education, stewardship, restoration, and conservation to better meet our mission. I'm going to skip this because I already had an introduction. There's a picture of my beautiful family. This is probably the nicest slide, prettiest slide in the thing. So I know it's right after lunch, so in order to keep you all awake, I'm going to start off with cool pictures of fire, and then at the end I'm going to have pretty pictures of rare plants. So stay with me. I'll try to keep it interesting. So I want to set a little historical context. In 1993, the Laguna Beach fire started on 133, where the star is there, burned into Laguna Beach and the surrounding green belt, burned 16,000 acres, destroyed over 400 homes, caused more than $500 million of property damage. It was clocked at burning over 100 acres per minute. There were 200-foot flame lengths, as you can see in that upper right-hand picture. And this all happened in one burning period. So the collective memory, or maybe I should say trauma, of this event has really set the tone for fire safety and vegetation management in this community. Now, since then, things have changed, as you might know. This is a study out of UCSB and Nature Conservancy that talks about long-term trends in wildfire damages in California. And as you might be able to guess, all the trends are up. There's clear increasing trends in overall area burned, wilderness-urban interface area burned, number of structures burned, and fatalities. And there's charts in the study of all of these different things, but they all more or less go in the same direction. As you can see, I just chose the one chart here, which is wildland-urban interface acres burned. And as you can see, in 1979, we were in the small numbers of tens of thousands of acres per year. And now, in 2018, we're approaching 1 million acres per year. So huge increases. We've had a couple of local fires in the last year that kind of highlight some of the different ways in which fire is burning over this landscape. We primarily have coastal sage scrub and southern maritime chaparral habitat types around Laguna Beach. So the emerald fire started in February, not typical fire season. Luckily, because there were no other fires burning in the state at that time, there were lots of suppression resources, and they were able to get a hold of it pretty quickly. 1,500 people needed to evacuate, but no structures were lost. So even more anomalously, in May, we had the coastal fire, and it started in the afternoon on a day that was relatively cool with onshore breezes. Most of our high fire spread days happen when there's the Santa Ana winds that come from the deserts towards the ocean. This was an onshore breeze, very high humidities, and yet the fire started at the bottom of the canyon, you can see on your right there, and burned up to the ridgetop, destroying over 20 houses within the tens of minutes. So pretty severe fire behavior for May. So pretty pictures of fire, yay. This is a map of the city of Laguna Beach. The dotted line shows around the red area shows the city boundaries. The red area is the area of very high fire hazard severity, which comprises over 87% of the city. Obviously, vegetation management and fire safety is always at the top of the list of priorities for the city. So their vegetation management program has 4 components. Their weed abatement program, fuel modification for new development, defensible space program, which deals with the area right around people's homes and their yards, and then a series of 27 fuel modification zones around the city, which is what I'd like to talk to you about today. So we have 2 primary ways that we do the fuel modification treatment. The first one, which is in 10 different zones over 250 acres, is the goat grazing. These are done under nuisance abatement statutes, and they predate the Coastal Act. So these areas are not under the Coastal Act. They don't have coastal development permits. The goats do 1 pass per year. Some advantages of using goats is that they tend to be very cost effective compared to hand crews. And they're charismatic. Everybody loves it when the goats show up. In fact, the city can't really post where the goats are because people come to the goats and cause all kinds of crazy problems. They take the goats home and give them spa days, and some disadvantages of using goats is that the goats eat what they want to eat, and they don't eat what they don't want to eat, and that varies depending on times of year. There are operational limitations to goats. You need a certain sized area to make it economically make sense. We've tried using them in new areas under coastal development permits, but in general, we found that it just doesn't make sense. They cause erosion. If you have to very carefully manage the goats if you're going to get good results. So our other method that we use is hand crew treatment. So these are used in areas of high and very high value habitat. They do require coastal development permits. We've got 9 zones in the maintenance phase, 4 zones in permitting currently, and 2 more zones will complete the system of fuel modification zones around the city. These will total 175 acres. This method of treatment is relatively expensive. For maintenance, it costs approximately 5 times as much as using the goats. We have received grant funding. We've had a CAL FIRE grant and some FEMA grants to help defray the costs of the permitting and also the initial treatment, which is very labor intensive. And then those areas go into the city fund covers the ongoing maintenance in those areas. These treatments require highly skilled workers, lots of training and close oversight. And that oversight component is what Laguna Canyon Foundation does. We train the workers, and then we direct them. We do we help design the prescriptions and the treatment areas and tell the crews what to do, where to do it, and when to do it. And we have great crews. So the treatment protocol for these hand crew treatment areas is, first of all, the treatment area is limited to within 100 feet of primary flammable structures. That's what the best available science supports. Anything beyond that really isn't probably going to have much effect on what happens to the homes in a wildfire. We do pre-treatment surveys for sensitive species, and we create buffers around the sensitive species and the streams. We also do pre-treatment archaeological, cultural, paleontological, and geotechnical surveys, and there are some areas that are excluded from treatment due to the results of those surveys. Within the treatment area, the crews will go in and remove all the non-native and dead vegetation, and that's all taken off-site. All the non-native material is taken off-site. Then, in order to get to our target, which is 50% remaining native cover, if they need to, they'll go in and start trimming some of the native vegetation. So, and they'll do this based on a species hierarchy, starting with the species that have the highest relative flammability and the lowest relative habitat value, and going down the list until they hit that 50% target. For the remaining vegetation, the larger vegetation, they'll prune up to remove ladder fuels, and then all of the native cut material gets chopped up and spread out on the ground as mulch to reduce germination of weeds and also prevent erosion. So what does this look like? This is a view about basically standing on the outside of the fuel modification zone, looking towards the houses at the top of the slope there. As you can see some cut vegetation in the openings between the remaining vegetation there. So yeah, it looks pretty park-like. There's a lot of remaining vegetation. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might not even realize that this was a fuel modification area. So it preserves a lot of the aesthetic values as well as a lot of the habitat values in these areas. I forgot to say on one of my previous slides, the goal of these treatments is to reduce the rate of spread and the fireline intensity by approximately 70%. And there's fire modeling to show that. And it's not, we can't reduce the risk of wildfire to our communities to zero. That's just not possible. So the goal of these treatments is to increase the time that people have to get out of the neighborhoods and increase the space that firefighters have to get in between the houses and the wildfire in order to do their jobs with an adequate safety margin. So this is what it looks like from the ground. This is what it looks like from overhead. So you can see, and this is the same area. I wish I had a pointer, but there's the photo was taken. Is there?
Yeah, on the right.
Oh, is this it? Haha. Okay, so the last photo was taken from right about here, looking up towards these houses here, and so you can definitely see that there's a large difference between the treated area here and the intact vegetation farther away from the houses. So there's a significant amount of work done while trying to strike that balance between fire safety and protecting the habitat and aesthetic values. So now come the pretty plant pictures. So one of the sensitive species that we have that we deal the most with is the big-leaf crownbeard, Verbicida indicida. It's one of our state and federally listed as threatened species. It's a 1B1. And this plant's endemic to Laguna Beach, South Laguna Beach in the southern maritime chaparral habitat types, and then also to Baja California around Ensenada. Those are the only places that it grows. There's a picture of a patch doing really well in 2017, one of our wettest years of the decade. This is actually, you can see this is in the area that had had a fire a few years previously. So that's what it looks like when it's doing well. So This is an example of one of the buffers that we put around the sensitive species to prevent the crews from impacting them. We put the buffer fencing up about 15 feet from the edges of the population. We used to very laboriously put this orange construction fencing up on these very steep slopes to protect them. Now that we have a lot more trust established with our hand crews, we can just flag those areas and trust that the crews aren't going to impact those populations. We've also got some flexibility now with the Coastal Commission where we can go in and treat non-native species in these buffers if we deem it, good for the populations. We also have Laguna Beach Dudleya, a very charismatic plant. This is our other state and federally listed as threatened species. And we don't have to deal with this too much in the fuel modification areas because it tends to grow on cliffs, and it's pretty hard to do fuel modification on cliffs. But it's a cool plant. We also have the Dudleya multicaulis. We've got a couple of the Mariposa lilies, intermediate Mariposa lily and Catalina Mariposa lily. Thanks to Ron for a lot of the photos in this. Oops. And another cool plant we have is cliff spurge, Euphorbia misera. This is another plant of the southern maritime chaparral that grows in South Laguna and down south of there. I've yet to actually see one of these. This is on my bucket list. We've got a lot of culture Matilaha poppy, Rhamnia coulteri. Most of the Matilaha poppy that we encounter in the fuel modification zones is assumed to be ornamental plantings, but we protect it as a sensitive species nonetheless. It's always fun to see. We also have Western dichondria, another 4.2, another southern maritime chaparral species. This one, there are historical records in some of the fuel modification zones, but I've seen it nearby, proximal, but not actually in any of our fuel mod zones. Paniculate tar plant is an annual that grows in our coastal sage scrub areas. Again, we don't have to worry too much about this. Usually we can time our treatments to avoid it when it's growing and it doesn't cause us too many issues. And finally, we've got the fish's milkwort, Polygala cornuta variety fishiae. This is another one that's endemic to the Southern California coast in Baja. I've found one of these once in one fuel modification zone, one season. It was surrounded by fountain grass, and I've never been able to find it again. Okay, so I'd just like to finish up by talking about a few lessons learned. First one is a fuel modification project is only as good as its maintenance. If some of you heard the talk yesterday where they were talking about the tropic thunder approach, where groups come in and tend to think that they can come in once and do something and leave and fix the problem, that doesn't work. And you can actually make things a lot worse. As Greg Rubin was saying this morning, if one of the worst things you can have is unhealthy native plants with non-native weeds underneath them. That's just the perfect mix of light flashy fuels and heavier dried out fuels to really cause a lot of nasty fire behavior and take out a lot of houses. So if you're going to do fuel modification, you have to commit to maintaining it. Our hand crews go through our maintenance areas 2 to 3 times per year throughout, depending on what the weather's like that year, to keep it within specification. Occasionally, there are hiccups that cause us to miss a treatment. This is an example of that, where you can see some pretty large castor bean and some non-native grasses and stuff growing up underneath, and we do our best to avoid that and stay on top of the maintenance. A great example of why this is a problem is Paradise. The town of Paradise was almost completely wiped away by the campfire a few years ago. And one of the contributing factors is that they had gone in and done some fuel modification, but they had not kept up on the maintenance of those areas. And in that, there was they're just perfect conditions for a firestorm. Another lesson learned is that fuel modification can have habitat benefits if you do it properly. There are some areas that we have treated that started out as near 100% non-native cover, ornamentals and other invasives invading from the people's yards and around houses, if you remove, we have removed those, and now in some of those areas we have 50% native cover. So we've actually had a net gain in native plants and cover. Also, we're protecting the adjacent open spaces from invasion from ornamentals and other non-natives from the houses in the more populated areas, humans being great seed dispersers. So finally, fuel modification is a great opportunity for community education and involvement. We're tramping through these people's yards 2 to 3 times per year, and we have lots of opportunities to talk to them and to tell them about fire ecology and what we're doing and why we're doing it, and about all the cool plants that we have and why they're important, and how they provide habitat for lots of other important critters as well. Okay, so I'd like to finish just by acknowledging everybody who's made this project such a success, everybody else who works on this at Laguna Canyon Foundation, everybody from the fire department, and some of our consultants, and the folks at Nature's Image who provide our hand crews, especially Lalo Maldonado, the crew foreman, and his crew. I added a picture of the crew, but it was too late and I didn't get it uploaded. So if you want to see a picture of the crew, come and I'll show it to you on my phone. They're just awesome. They do a great job, and we couldn't do this work. They're the ones out there doing the hard work, and we couldn't do it without them. So I want to acknowledge their contributions. And so there's some contact information here. You can take a photo of this. You can call me or send me an email directly, check out our website, or go to the city website to see an interactive map of our fuel modification zones. And I'll leave you with this quote from the executive director of the California Coastal Commission about this project. And do we have any time for questions?
We do.
Do we have time? Thank you. Sorry, no questions.
But there'll be time at the end.
Yes, I will be here at the end. Hold your questions.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, we're going to do a round table at the end. And all of our speakers today will be there for roughly 20 minutes to answer questions. Our next speaker today is Tammie Beyerl. Thank you. She's a senior botanist and wetland ecologist at Ascent Environmental. She's worked as an environmental consultant in California for 20 years and has her MS in botany and plant biology from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking about the California Vegetation Treatment Program and its approaches for streamlining wildfire resilience projects in sensitive habitats and special status plant habitats. I'll start by briefly discussing wildfire setting in California, provide program description and background information for the Cal VTP, talk about the project-specific analysis process, the standard project requirements and mitigation measures that are included in the program EIR for the Cal VTP, and then I'll provide some tips on how the public can get involved with the Cal VTP implementation process. So as we all know and have been learning a lot about in this conference, decades of fire suppression, fuel accumulation, and climate change have created a new wildfire reality in California. So the number and acreage of wildfires have increased annually since 2010. Fire frequency, size, and intensity have all increased over the last 30 years. And these changes in fire behavior can result in stand replacing fires in communities that aren't adapted for that. Changes in species composition, total loss of habitat, loss of special status plant occurrences, destruction of sensitive natural communities, and loss of life and property. So part of the state's response has included an executive order from Governor Newsom in 2018 that mandated an increase in the pace and scale of vegetation treatments and reduced regulatory barriers to fuel reduction projects. That was followed also in 2018 by Senate Bill 1260 to reduce risk of catastrophic wildfire through improved forest management. Senate Bill 1260, later codified, promotes use of fuel reduction and prescribed burns, and it also specifically required a streamlined CEQA process to help expedite implementation of vegetation treatment for fire reduction within the state responsibility area. So the program area is the treatable landscape within the state responsibility area. And that's defined as a portion of the state responsibility area, or SRA, with vegetation conditions that are suitable for treatments. And that is essentially all vegetation types except for those that have a negligible risk of wildfire hazard, such as some wetland community types. The treatable landscape is approximately 20.3 million acres total. It's the yellow area on the map. The program area does not include federal lands or local responsibility areas, so areas that local jurisdictions are responsible for suppressing fire. And the CalVTP also does not include tree removal for commercial purposes. There are 3 treatment types that are covered under the program. Wildland-urban interface treatments, which are strategic removal of vegetation to prevent or slow the spread of non-wind-driven fire between structures and wildlands and vice versa. Fuel breaks, both shaded and non-shaded fuel breaks, and those are zones of vegetation removal and ongoing maintenance, often in a linear layout that provide responders with strategic access and staging for implementing fire control actions. And then the third treatment type is ecological restoration, and that puts a focus on restoring ecosystem processes, conditions, and resiliency by moderating uncharacteristic wildland fuel conditions with the goal of reflecting historic vegetative composition, structure, and habitat values. There are 5 treatment activities that are covered under the program. Prescribed burning, so both broadcast and pile burning. Manual vegetation treatment, which is vegetation modification using hand tools and hand-operated power tools. Targeted ground application of herbicides. Mechanical vegetation treatment, which uses heavy equipment such as tractors, skidders, and dozers to modify vegetation, and prescribed herbivory, also known as targeted grazing, that uses domestic livestock to modify vegetation, as our prior speaker was talking about. Goats are often used because they're more likely to eat shrubs, but cattle and other livestock are also used. So the CalVTP program EIR was certified by the Board of Forestry in December of 2019. A program EIR is used to expedite review for a series of actions that have similar impacts that can be mitigated in similar ways. If a subsequent project would have no new effects or require no additional mitigation, it's considered to be within the scope of the program EIR, and no additional CEQA document needs to be prepared or circulated to the public. Despite that lack of public review for projects going forward under the program EIR, at the end of my talk, I will give some information about how the public can get involved in some capacity with the implementation of CalVTP projects. So CEQA directs the use of a tailored checklist to analyze within the scope of a future project. For the CalVTP program EIR, we use a project-specific analysis, or PSA. It's a checklist-based evaluation of whether a subsequent vegetation treatment project qualifies as within the scope of the program EIR. The project must be consistent with the treatment types and activities that were described in the program EIR, and it cannot have any new or substantially more severe impacts than those that were contemplated in the program EIR. A mitigation and monitoring and reporting program accompanies the PSA, and that identifies the standard project requirements and mitigation measures from the program EIR that must be implemented to avoid and minimize impacts of the proposed project. All feasible mitigation measures from the program EIR that apply to the project being implemented must be incorporated into the project design. So standard project requirements, or SPRs for short, are environmentally protective requirements to avoid or minimize impacts of vegetation treatments. They're incorporated into later treatments consistent with the CalVTP as a standard part of treatment design and implementation. And the SPRs that are related to biological resources were developed through interagency coordination with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, State Water Resources Control Board, and the California Coastal Commission. So SPR Bio 1 requires data review and reconnaissance survey for when a project is beginning its project-specific analysis. So the first step is project-specific data review. The CalVTP EIR includes a biological setting section for each ecoregion within the state responsibility area. And these setting sections include tables with lists of potentially occurring special status plant species, special status wildlife species, and sensitive natural communities for each ecoregion. In addition to reviewing the relevant sections of the CalVTP EIR, project proponents are required to review the best available current information available for the area, including the best available vegetation mapping and species distribution and range information. And then from that data review, you would develop lists of potentially occurring species and sensitive natural communities that could be affected by the proposed treatment. So following the data review, a biological reconnaissance survey is required to assess the habitat suitability for the special status species and sensitive natural communities and wildlife as well. Just focusing on plants and vegetation here, but so you assess the suitability for those species that have been identified as potentially occurring. The recon survey should also spot, verify vegetation mapping layers that are being used, and identify other sensitive habitats such as riparian habitat, oak woodlands, and chaparral and coastal sage scrub. And then if it's determined that those resources, that there's habitat for those sensitive resources, then that habitat either needs to be avoided or additional surveys to determine presence absence need to be conducted. SPR Bio 7 requires protocol-level botanical surveys if special status plants have potential to occur in the proposed treatment areas. SPR Bio 3 requires focus surveys for sensitive natural communities, and those are sensitive natural communities identified by CDFW as sensitive, so those are the ones that have a state rarity rank of S1, S2, or S3. SPR Bio 5 requires that chaparral and coastal sage scrub communities be identified to the alliance level, and that there's an evaluation of their departure from natural fire return interval condition class, and treatments that are implemented in chaparral or coastal sage scrub have to be designed to maintain habitat function and avoid type conversion. For special status plant species, if they are listed under ESA or CISA as threatened or endangered species, a minimum 50-foot buffer of the occupied habitat of those plants needs to be implemented. unless it's determined through consultation with CDFW or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and with substantial evidence that listed plants would benefit from the treatment, even though some individuals may be lost. They also have to demonstrate that habitat function for the special status plants is reasonably expected to improve with implementation of the treatment. For species that are not state or federally listed but have a California rare plant rank, physical avoidance can be used. And if the species are annuals, stump sprouting species, or geophytes, seasonal avoidance can be used by implementing specific treatment types while the species is in its dormant phase or outside of the growing season. And the treatments would have to be designed, would have to be treatments that would not damage the stump or underground root system or other underground structures or destroy the seed bank. So the SPRs require that there's maintenance of habitat function. They have to provide documentation in the PSA for any exceptions. For example, if it's determined that the species would benefit from the treatment, documentation is required for that. And mitigation measure bio 3A requires that treatments be designed to avoid sensitive loss of natural communities and to replicate the natural fire regime attributes of the affected community. And then after consideration of all of the SPRs and the mitigation measures, the other mitigation measures, if it's determined that significant effects would still remain, then compensatory mitigation would be required. Generally, most project proponents are not going to want to get to that phase, so they're going to want to design their projects not to have loss. So how can you get involved with the implementation process of the CalVTP? So SPR 87 requires reporting on planned, approved, and completed projects under CalVTP. The Board of Forestry posts information on its CalVTP database webpage. Information provided includes an interactive map viewer with GIS point locations of all of the proposed, approved, and completed projects. It provides information on the size of the proposed project, typically in acres. It lists the treatment types and activities that are proposed and contact information for the project proponent or implementing entity. So involvement by resource experts and local knowledge can greatly improve treatment design. So my recommendation is that people who are interested in how these treatments are being carried out and what's happening, go to the CalVTP project map viewer, find projects that are of interest to you in areas that you may have information about, contact the listed project proponent contact and reach out and ask questions and provide additional data and research for consideration during development of the project. If you have information about, that there are certain, special status species or sensitive natural communities in the area that should be taken into account, if you're aware of research that's been done on fire effects of any of the special status species or sensitive natural communities in the area, by all means, reach out and provide that information. It also creates awareness that people are paying attention and seeing what's happening with the CalVTP projects. By becoming involved and providing information, we can all help to guide vegetation treatment design to protect the native plants and natural communities that we all love. Thanks very much for listening. I have time.
Do you have time for a couple of questions?
Oh,
I think this works.
thanks.
So if mitigation is required, who does the follow-up mitigation? And secondly, the previous speaker spoke to the fact that field modification is only as good as the follow-up maintenance. Is there any follow-up maintenance in the CalVTP program?
Yeah, there is. So the program does cover maintenance treatments. So when they do the project-specific analysis, the initial treatment and the follow-up maintenance treatments would be analyzed. So it does provide for maintenance treatments. And it would be the lead agency that's responsible for enforcing the mitigation. So that would be another place where the public should keep an eye out to be sure that, so for completed projects, the documentation that goes along with them is posted on the website as well. So that would include the mitigation monitoring and reporting program that you could review. And if, people notice that the mitigation isn't being implemented, contact the project proponent and lead agency.
Ready? Okay. This is about the PSA. Once the agency prepares that, the checklist, and submits it, does CAL FIRE actually approve each project, or is it just filed?
Yeah, I mean, they have oversight, but they approve, so the project proponent submits an application to be covered under the Cal VTP.
We have time for one more. Where was it?
I had another maintenance question. Given that maintenance is so important, for projects that are submitting the PSA to be covered under Cal VTP, what if maintenance funding, the funding to do the maintenance activities, has not been procured yet? Could a project still be approved, and what would those maintenance activities have to be detailed with the funding TBD note, or how would one approach that if that was the scenario you were in?
The funding for maintenance treatments, that's a good question. I don't really have the answer. I don't know if they have to demonstrate that they have funds in place to carry out the maintenance, as they describe in their project description. What was the other part of your question?
And my other question was, how detailed do you have to be in your maintenance activities? Can a project be approved if the maintenance details have not been fleshed out yet?
The maintenance needs to be described also in the project description in the PSA. So they have to detail the maintenance treatment design. Yep, thank you.
Is everyone still awake yet? This is the lull afternoon. Just want to encourage you guys all right now just to turn to your partner and elbow or fist bump, because everyone in this room does amazing work throughout the state. You're all doing the good work for rare plants. Okay, just a few seconds, kind of liven the room again. I want to introduce our next speaker. Her name is Jodi McGraw. Jodi is the principal of Jodi McGraw Consulting, a Santa Cruz County-based firm that implements applied research and projects to protect rare and endangered species and conservation biology, or biodiversity. She specializes in edaphic endemic systems, including the Santa Cruz Sandhills, and she has 29 years of experience conducting applied conservation research, restoration, habitat management, and endangered species recovery. All right, she's going to be telling you about the reintroduction of the Ben Lomond wallflower. Right. Oh.
Well, great. Thanks so much for sticking around. I'm going to jump right in because I have a lot to share from my work with my collaborators. So as many of you have heard in the conference so far, anthropogenic drivers at various scales and types are driving rare plant extirpations. And in order to prevent species from going extinct, we may need to consider in many cases, and we are, doing rare plant reintroductions and introductions. In order to be successful, however, these introductions really need to take into consideration the full spectrum of factors that are going to influence long-term population persistence. And unfortunately, a lot of these factors are poorly understood for a lot of our rare plant species. And this can really benefit, though, in doing reintroductions to use experimental approaches to fill those key data gaps. I've listed here on the right just some of the considerations: abiotic and biotic habitat factors, disturbance regimes, factors innate to the species and their populations, including mating system. This list can be expanded, so don't take a picture of it and cite it. It's not a comprehensive list. So my collaborators and I, we explored a experimental rare plant introduction in the Santa Cruz Sandhills, which if you're not familiar with the Sandhills, I strongly encourage you to become familiar with them. They're a fascinating edaphic endemic ecosystem that's found south of here about 30 miles in the central Santa Cruz County. And they're only found in Santa Cruz County, where there's uplifted marine sediment that was laid down about 15 million years ago when the area was underneath a vast sea. Due to the unique droughty sand soil, which is very low nutrient, it combines with a maritime climate that's very moist and gives rise to two plant communities that are found nowhere else in the world. There's a form of northern maritime chaparral that's dominated by the endemic silverleaf manzanita, which we call locally sand chaparral, and then maritime coast range ponderosa pine forests, which is locally referred to as sand parkland. And these communities support unique assemblages of plants and animals that are only found in the sandhills, including numerous endemic species, 4 plants and 2 insects, but those are really just the tip of the iceberg. There's much more taxonomic research that's needed, and there's many other endemic species still to be described. Sandhills ecology is really driven and greatly influenced by disturbance and plays an important role at various spatial scales and in various types. For purposes of this talk, fire is obviously a key disturbance factor that I'll be talking about. We don't know a ton about the disturbance regime, the natural disturbance regime of fire in the Sandhills, though the last 20 years have elucidated some important aspects. But most importantly, the dominant plant species, including silverleaf manzanita and also ponderosa pine, are really adapted to establishing in post-fire conditions. At a smaller spatial scale, the sandy soil of the Sandhills results in small-scale soil disturbances like slides, trails, and gopher mounds. These both act the same way that fire does, just at a smaller spatial scale, to promote native plant populations and increase diversity by removing litter that accumulates on the soil surface, reducing competition, including that caused by exotic plant species which have become established in the system, and also for some species stimulating seed germination. Sandhills communities were naturally rare to begin with. There's probably about 6,300 acres historically. There's about 4,000 acres if you include all the habitat, including some residentially developed areas that still support some species. The habitat loss has taken its toll. Habitat degradation is having important impacts on even protected habitat. For this talk, I'll focus on the fire exclusion of fire in the landscape, which has been necessitated by the proximity of Sandhills habitat to residential development, has altered the structure and species composition, and especially had implications for species adapted to early successional conditions. So this is a site, a really important Sandhill site, Henry Cowell, which I'll put a plug for Tim Hyland, who's giving a talk later this afternoon about their work there. It's 1940, you can see all the open bare sand soil that supports species adapted to open canopy conditions, compared to most recently, very little of that habitat remains, and most of what you're seeing is rock outcrops. Climate change is obviously having a huge effect overlaying all this. Species that are adapted to low nutrient and droughty conditions are being stressed, though, due to the mega drought and also the increased temperatures. The last 8 years have had above average temperatures, and we've had a series of droughts in the last 2 decades. So this is putting a lot of stress on even species that are adapted to those conditions, including the Ben Lomond wallflower. It's a biennial to short-lived perennial herb in the Brassicaceae. It's generally monocarpic, meaning it reproduces just once. It takes about 2 to 3 years for the plant to bolt and flower, and then it typically dies, although plants can occasionally parinate. It's endemic to the Sandhills. It was listed in 1981 as state endangered, and then in 1994 as federally endangered. And, to add insult to injury with its difficulties, it has a weakly self-incompatible mating system. Basically, when the plants self, they produce very few seeds, and then those seeds suffer from late-acting inbreeding depression. So they have lower survivorship and reproduction. So as I mentioned, it preferentially occurs in open sandy areas, and these areas can be created and maintained through fire and also soil disturbances which promote the populations, including by reducing exotic plant abundance. Unfortunately, about 95% of seedlings that establish die during the first summer, and due in large part due to desiccation stress and competition with exotics. So one of the things we've seen, about 5 of the 17 populations that were documented in the late 1970s have become extirpated. So it's obviously a really important species to consider for reintroduction, including at this site, the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve. The Ecological Reserve is a 552-acre sandhill site. Fabulous place to go if you haven't been there. It's one of the highest conservation value sites. It was protected in 1989 by the Nature Conservancy when it was proposed for development as a vineyard. It's managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And in 1993, when I started working there in grade school, there was 2 populations. A northern one and a southern one. The northern one was sadly extirpated in 1994, and the southern one has had fewer than 20 adult individuals since 2013. So it's been basically just hanging on by a thread. So I got together with some collaborators who've been doing some wallflower research. I bring the ecological aspect, and my collaborator, Justin Whittall, is a plant geneticist and did a lot of the reproduction biology. And we set out to do an experimental reintroduction. Our project was designed to answer some key questions that could help inform introduction at this site and also at future other sites. One of our questions is, what are the effects of soil disturbance and as an enhancement treatment for the wallflower at the sites? The other one is, what are the genetic considerations that we need to keep in mind given the self-incompatibility alleles and the reduced populations? And then habitat conditions. What are the abiotic and biotic factors that we want to introduce when we're choosing introduction sites? In terms of project goals, they're pretty similar. We wanted to examine 2 alternative disturbance treatments to mimic the beneficial effects of fire and small-scale soil disturbances. We wanted to evaluate whether the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve genetic type population is locally adapted to those conditions. It's a higher elevation and closer to the coast than a lot of the other sandhill sites, and it's also disjunct from a lot of the other sandhills populations. So there's definitely a potential for local genetic adaptation. So we wanted to look at that, and then conversely see if outcrossing, interbreeding could actually help reduce the inbreeding depression that we're seeing amongst populations. And then also look at the suitable habitat conditions, and finally just get wallflower established at the site, because it's barely hanging on there. So we did this with a small-scale experimental manipulative experiment, and it was replicated in 2 years, which was really great because we ended up with 1 year, the 2019 rainfall year, had 200 centimeters of rainfall, which was twice that in the following year, the 2020 rainfall year, where you can see, for example, we had no rain in the entire month of February. We monitored it for 2 years, lots of 2s here. We had 2 community types, the sand chaparral community, which differs greatly in species composition and structure from the sand parkland community. We had 4 blocks in each of the 2 community types. We looked at 2 disturbance treatments as alternatives. So we know that the site you can't just seed wallflower out there. It will not establish or grow. That's my prior dissertation research had demonstrated enough of that. So we jumped right in with 2 alternative treatments. One was raking the soil. So we just basically used a rock rake to remove the litter and a lot of the established plants from the soil surface. The other one raked and then involved tilling the soil to create loose, fluffy sand soil to a depth of about 30 centimeters. So this was pretty labor intensive, if you can imagine. We'll be looking for other ways to scale this up, but it basically just shoveled and turned over the soil in the ground. This was done in an experimental block design where we had 2 replicate plots in each of the 2 years. And we also, that we seeded and planted, which I'll talk about, we also had an unseeded, unplanted plot just in case there was a seed bank out there and it would magically appear. Unfortunately, we did not get any plants establishing in our unseeded, unplanted plots. So we'll talk about those further. Here's our plot design. We had a 4-meter squared plot, so 2 meters on each side. In the center of the plot, we had a nested seed plot, which was 1 meter by 1 meter, where we sowed, broadcast seeded 1,369 seeds of the wallflower by weight. Our genetic treatment was arrayed by outplanting transplants from the greenhouse that were of each of the 4 genetic treatment combinations. So to look at for local adaptation, we had Bonnie Doon only genotype to compare that to, which we could obviously compare to the non-Bonnie Doon genotype, which was taken from one of the other sites. Then to look for heterosis, which again is better performance of plants after mixing and genetic mixing, we had Bonnie Doon crossed with non-Bonnie Doon, as well as just 2 non-Bonnie Doon genotypes crossed to see if that's just the heterosis. So those were 36 plants planted in the ring around the seeded plot. We took a lot of data collection in the 2 years. We looked at soil conditions, soil depth, texture, chemistry, and including macronutrients and micronutrients. We looked at plant community composition by species, looking, of course, aggregating the data for native and exotic plants, and also keeping an eye out and measuring data, collecting data for Ben Lomond spineflower and Ben Lomond buckwheat, which are 2 of the other rare and endangered herbaceous plants that occur in this system. For wallflower, we took a demographic approach to our data collection and study. So we wanted to be able to generate the demographic rates and look at their effects on population growth. So and these are our seeded plots. We marked every single plant that came up every couple months for the entire spring, and we used toothpicks to mark them so we could track their survivorship over time. We looked at reproduction, which is a really important, that's like the percentage of plants that reproduce in a given year, as well as seed production, which is obviously the amount of seed produced, which is also obviously very important. So what did we find? First, I'll look at the disturbance treatments. These are in the seeded plots. In these graphs, the till treatment is on the right in green, and the rake is on the left in gray. And the year 1 results are on top, and the year 2 are on the bottom. And importantly, the year 1 plots we were able to monitor for 2 years, but the year 2 plots we were only able to monitor for a single year. So first, you can see that establishment was not affected in either year by raking versus tilling. Again, we didn't have a control, but what we learned was that raking alone was sufficient to establish wallflower. It did as well as the tilling treatment. And you can see in the 2019 year, we had nearly 75% of our seeds produced a plant, which is really remarkable. We were really pleased with that result. In a droughtier year, 2020, the rate was about a third of that. Survivorship for 2 years in the year 1 plots was significantly increased by tilling, so we had a benefit of that tilling treatment. You didn't see it in just the first year in the 2020, the year 2 plots. Sorry, so there's no benefit there, but if we followed those for another year, I'm sure we would have seen the benefit as well. The effects of tilling really accrued over time and had a pronounced effect on reproduction as well as seed production. So you basically get in these tilled plots, you had much higher seed production. Same thing happened with the transplanted seedlings, just we monitored those as well. You didn't see effect in the first year outplanting the seedlings into the rake versus the rakes on the left and the till still on the right. But the second year we did see the effect. That's obviously the effect of the drier conditions. Tilling reduced competition, as I'll show you. Reproduction was benefited though in both years in the transplanted seedlings, and seed production was not affected amongst the transplanted seedlings. But overall, tilling definitely helps wallflower. And so what's the mechanism? I mean, clearly it's largely driven by just reducing competition. Those till plots had like nothing growing them initially, and you can see the tills on the top in green, and the gray is the raking on the bottom, the wallflower size on the left. It just, they took off and got much bigger with reduced competition. This is total cover, is significantly higher in most time steps in the rake plots than the other plots. And we saw a negative correlation between wallflower size and both exotic cover and native cover. So a lot of it was certainly just reduced competition. This is a species that just can't hack competing with other species. But we also saw, we had a lot of rake plots that occurred in the San Chaparral community where there's very low cover. And so clearly there's another mechanism going on. And unfortunately, we kind of hoped we would detect it with some of the soil nutrient measurements. There certainly is evidence for increased soil nutrient availability, nitrogen chief among them in response to soil disturbances, but we did not detect that in this study. I'm not saying it's not there, but we just didn't see a significant effect on soil nutrients. But there's something about the looseness, and I would just love it if anyone has any idea about what loose soil does for this plant. It's been bugging me for the last 25 years. It's just the genetic treatment. I'll just kind of won't do a deep of a dive on this. Basically, the 4 different genetic treatments performed differently in different years in the different demographic rates that we tested. And so there was not a significant evidence for either local adaptation, which would be with the Bonny Doon plants did better than the non-Bonny Doon plants, nor was there significant evidence of consistent outbreeding depression, which would be if the crosses did better than the single genotypes. So we did see that the hybrid genotype, the Bonny Doon, when it's crossed with a non-Bonny Doon, did perform better, not always significantly so, but was in the higher group in 5 out of 7 of the measures that we, over the 2 years, including survivorship, which is what I'm showing here. So there is some suggestion that heterosis may be at play, that there is some benefit of outcrossing. We also looked at habitat conditions. Again, as I mentioned, one of our goals is to figure out where to put the plant. We used non-metric multidimensional scaling to look at plant species composition. We looked at we used principal components analysis to tease out some of the soil variables. You can see there's a lot of variability in plant species space and also amongst the 2 communities and the soil types, which were really interesting to learn about in terms of how those correlated for wallflower. The biggest indication we got is that wallflower did better in the lower fertility soils. Again, it's mostly an indication that it's a poor competitor. The lower fertility soils had less exotic plants, so it was really more of a referendum on the exotic plants. We were able to establish wallflower through this study in all 8 locations. Wallflower performance in the 8 locations, which are shown here, varied among the blocks. We're using a little colorimetric scale here where wallflower performance is low to high, brown to green. And what was interesting is kind of like the genetic treatments, there was not a consistent result where one block always did better if you looked at all the different demographic rates. For example, SP2 had really high survivorship, reproduction, and seed production, so just produced a ton of seed in the end of the day, so that was great, but had really low establishment. And conversely, some of the sand chaparral plots, including SC1, had a much higher establishment, but had lower rates of survivorship and reproduction. So this suggests that different aspects of the habitat are interacting with the plant and its performance in various aspects of its life history to influence how it's going to do. So it's a very complex picture that I'm hoping to tease out more with maybe some demographic modeling and matrix models at some point. So just to summarize then, what did we learn for introductions? Loosening the soil for Ben Lomond wallflower through tilling or some other mechanism is going to be really beneficial. We did see a little bit of a waning of the beneficial effect of the tilling over time, even in just the 2 years that we monitored, suggesting that maintaining those open sandy soil conditions is going to require some low intensity, low frequency disturbance. For the genetic considerations, we think that genetic mixing is unlikely to be detrimental and may actually help, especially when we're addressing issues associated with self-incompatibility that we're seeing out there in the declining populations. And then finally, in terms of habitat, I think it's just kind of a bet hedging strategy is probably good to address the fact that different habitats influence the plant differentially in different life stages. And so just putting out in a bunch of different habitat conditions is probably going to help, especially as interannual variability in precipitation likely interacts with those conditions to ultimately influence the effect on wallflower. But obviously, reduced exotic plant cover in areas of lower fertility are going to be ultimately more sustainable unless you can have a lot of time and effort to manage the exotics. Other lessons that we learned is outplanting seedlings was really beneficial. I would not have thought to outplant, if we weren't doing the genetic study, I would not have outplanted a biennial. It seemed it's very time intensive to get them going in the greenhouse, of course, and so certainly that has to be weighed against. But they basically, just that little, I called it the jump start program, like with the turtles, that if you put them in the greenhouse for a couple of weeks and grow them out, then they survive and they at high rates that first spring, and they actually flower their first year. So that gets them through avoids the bottleneck that we see every summer when a large proportion of the seedlings do die. So that's something to think about for getting the population established. And then larger treatment areas are going to have a more beneficial effect. We did see some edge effects from our 4-meter square plots. Most notably, we had a fair amount of small mammal herbivory adjacent to shrubs that harbor small mammals. And we also had exotic plants recolonizing our plots after the treatment. So obviously having a bigger treatment area would reduce those effects. And then the Ben Lomond spine flower and Ben Lomond buckwheat also established at very high rates without seeding in our plots. They are disturbance adapted species too, and so a lot of other native species for the Sandhills established well. So we're not, this isn't just a single species management thing, it's actually going to have benefits for several other species as well. So just kind of current status, the plants have persisted since we first seeded in 2018, despite a lot of factors we have going against us, one of which is the multi-year drought. We've had 3 drought years, and then we also had the CZU lightnings fire that came through in 2020. The fire itself didn't cause any issues, but a fire control line was put in right into some of our blocks, and so that impacted some of them. And then we also borrowed some seed, which I'll talk about for our next phase. I guess good news, we are seeing some seedlings leaving the plots in the treatment areas, expanding out, so that's always good, hopefully taking advantage of expanding the population. So just real quickly, we are going to take advantage of the CZU lightning complex fire that burned part of the ecological reserve to try to scale up this introduction and expand the population. This fall, we seeded the area that was burned by the fire, and we also seeded the field break that was created because it created that loose sandy soil through the chaparral that we're hoping can actually promote this species. And we're planning to have, so we're kind of scaling that up basically, and we're planning to even consider having trails at some point, if it works out, meander through the treatment areas to maintain the loose soil conditions, sort of using managed recreation. So my time is up, but I do want to just acknowledge all the amazing people who contributed to this project, including many CNPS volunteers, UCSC interns, and the funding from the CDFW and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you.
Okay, and again, we can do questions for Jodi after our final speaker, who is Todd Lemaine. He's a botanist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Ventura, California. His job includes implementing and tracking recovery of federally listed plant species in close cooperation with partners, landowners, and regulatory agencies. Sort of picking up where Jodi left off, he'll be talking about response of Santa Cruz cypress to the CZU lightning complex fire in 2020 and also the Martin fire in 2008.
Okay, thank you. Does everybody hear me okay? I'm a bit nervous. You know, we're all coming back to presentations again after having been away from it for so long. So I don't think I've spoke in front of a group this big for quite some time. So thank you. So I'm Todd. I do work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I primarily do recovery actions. That includes any listings, species status assessments, 5-year reviews. I do want to say I really appreciate the work of partners like Jodi and all of you guys who provide information, because I basically go out and scratch all that information up and try and condense it into status assessments that then get put into the 5-year reviews, which make determinations for if we're going to uplist a species, downlist a species, or delist a species. So thank you to my co-authors, Jodi and Terrace with CDFW, and Jen Mickelson at the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council. I will say right away, though, this is going to be somewhat of a qualitative assessment. We are basically just finished up the first year of a multi-year project. It is very pertinent, and I wanted this audience to hear the results that we do have presently, but they will be qualitative. Just some brief background. So Santa Cruz cypress, we listed it as Cupressus abramsiana, which means that we are including the variety abramsiana as well as the variety butanoensis, just as how the federal government recognizes the taxa. The species occurs in the coastal range from about Pescadero in San Mateo County to Davenport in Santa Cruz County. It occurs on pockets of well-drained, shallow, sandy soils, and it's typically surrounded by stands of mixed forests, including coast redwood, Doug fir, Pacific madrone, and Pacific ponderosa pine. Typically, Santa Cruz cypress occurs in these little pockets of nutrient-poor, well-drained soils while surrounded by deeper soils supporting these larger trees. North to south, the populations should also note that there are 5 recognized populations, and that's it. North to south, they're Butano Ridge, and if I have Jodi's pointer up here. So, sorry, Butano Ridge, Eagle Rock, Bracken Brae, Bonnie Dune, and Majors Creek. The red outline here is the perimeter of the CZU lightning complex fire, which burned in 2020. And the down here, I can't get my angle quite right, but is where the Martin fire occurred, which did burn a portion of the 5th population, which I think I talk about. I'll go back to this since I'm on fire. So the CZU lightning complex fire is the larger one, 86,000 acres over 1 month. And the big fire burned consistently and then was gone. It partially burned the Bracken Brae population and the Majors Creek population. We actually had thought that it had burned the entirety of those 2 populations before we were able to get out and do this work. And it completely burned Butano and Eagle Rock. Whereas the Martin fire in 2008, which is much smaller, is only 520 acres, which occurred over about 2 weeks, and it burned half of the 5th population in 2008. So what does this mean? So the reason why I had this regulatory text slide up here is because species was listed as federally endangered in 1987. We downlisted it, meaning we being the federal government. I started my job at 2018, so hold the tomatoes if you didn't want that downlist to happen. But I did author the most current review of the species, and this came following the lightning complex fire. And as I'll talk a little bit more, the reason why it was downlisted is because the threats that had been considered at listing were no longer the dominant threats facing the species, and many of the populations had been transferred to properties where the manager considered the conservation of the species a priority. So it went from endangered to threatened. And then this giant fire happened, and although we think the species is fire adapted, you have 4 out of 5 populations, and to my mind at the time, being completely, totally burned, it's like we're at a moment here, we need to be tracking this and following it, because maybe this is no longer threatened to climate change, anthropogenic sources, competition with weeds. What is going to happen to the species after this happens? We want it to be a good thing, but we don't want to just assume that it's going to be a good thing. So one of the revised threats from the down list was alteration of the fire regime. So fire can be good, but I mean, is it going to burn hot? Also, are we going to get another fire right away? Are we going to start to see that, in which case the plant doesn't put out seeds right away? So even if you did have initial germination, you might still have a big mortality event because you're burning too frequently. And then non-native species, climate change. We're no longer in a typical environment anymore. So there's a lot of things changing. So a bit more. Fire is a regeneration event. From the Bonnie Dune population, we could see that the cones will open with just age. They will open with fire. And then you can see ones that had already opened, but then probably opened some more with the fire. And this is pretty subjective. And I was talking with my predecessor, Connie, and I think we're out there with Terrace as well. So this is what we think we're seeing when we look at cones across the Bonnie Dune Ecological Reserve in areas that we know were burned and in areas that we know were not burned. So fire is a regeneration event. Historically, yes. But again, once again, things have changed. So when you're doing the status review, is well, what is going on and what is going to happen in the future? And as a person who is going to try and go out and get project work for recovery and to get people to do work, it's well, what should we be doing and how should we be tracking this? And that's kind of, maybe I'm overemphasizing how little we know, because I get pretty nervous when I talk about it. I'm oh, we think it's going to regenerate, but we don't really know where we are. So if we look at an alternative stable state sort of model, we think we had populations that were more or less stable prior to these fires. And they were pretty well set in there. A lot of these populations are very hard to get to. The fire suppression activities probably meant that the fuel load was high compared to historical, typical fire regimes. But the populations were there. There was no evidence of senescence or mortality occurring through disease or age or anything like that we know of. And so this CZU put us right up on this precipice with 4 of the 5 populations getting pretty severely burned in a very high severity fire. And so now are we going to roll back down? Is it going to regenerate? And we're going to sit in this nice little deep pocket here? Or are we going to go into another deep pocket of not so niceness with drought conditions, increased temperatures, possibly invasion from non-native species? So where are we? So I very, very nicely asked Jodi if she would put a proposal in to do the work to look at this, and she said yes. So I'm actually presenting Jodi's second presentation, whether you guys know it or not. But as the federal representative, I was seeing this issue and being like, we should really push it forward. So that was kind of my role, is to plant the seeds of idea for the proposal. Jodi is the one doing the proposal, and our other partners are CDFW and the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Question. So again, how is it going to respond? So what are we seeing right now? This past year, we were able to go out and get our eyes on the site, and this is the first year. This is the qualitative assessment year to kind of guide how we're going to move into a more quantitative estimation of what's going on. How are we going to describe it more quantitatively? So at Butano Ridge is the most northern population, and if you this is also the population that has the variety Butanoensis, and this is the only population that has it. So if they were ever to split the species, this is the only place that this occurs in the world. There is a complete mortality of all adult trees. Notably, there were no canopy cones. I'm not sure if you heard a presentation yesterday about someone talking about the aerial seed bank with cones being present there in the canopy and not aiding regeneration. There were no cones left at this particular site in the canopy. The recruitment that was observed here was low, and it was best at the ecotone, typically where the soils might be a little deeper, maybe a little more nutrients, and in drainages and under chaparral, both possibly conditions indicating a desire for more water during these drought conditions. There was rapidly establishing chaparral, so competition from native species potentially, and then also patchy and dense exotic grasses, which you can see here in the foreground. And we have some thin soils, less understory cover here, so that's why it's patchy, like pretty dense, not as much dense, and then some so we're proving to you that there is some regeneration happening, which is what we would expect to see and what we would like to see. When we start seeing like really dense stands of exotic grasses coming in, it gets me a little nervous. At Eagle Rock, another site of complete mortality. At this site, the fire might have burned a little less severely, and so there were canopy cones present. Patchy and low recruitment here as well. And again, the recruitment that is being observed is being found at the ecotone and in drainages and under chaparral. So it's sort of a similar response, which could make sense because this is all contiguous habitat under similar conditions. Again, rapidly establishing chaparral, dense exotic grasses. Here, some stress from desiccation was noted. And there was also a difference in the spatial distribution of recruitment. So the east stand, which is this area, had very low recruitment relative to the other portions of this particular population. I apologize for not having numbers. I'm using terms like high recruitment, low recruitment, medium recruitment, and we don't have that quantified yet. That's going to be part of the next phase. At Bracken Brae, this is out of the 5 populations, the only one that's on private property still, but it's owned by someone who cares very deeply about the species. 135 trees survived, mostly in areas of rock outcrop that we assume had less fuel. There were canopy cones present. This is a parcel of land that does abut a residential area. There was moderate recruitment, so this is out of the 4 sites in the CZU Lightning Complex fire, this was the site that had the highest recruitment. And the reason why we're calling it just moderate recruitment is because it is still less than what was observed following the 2008 Martin fire at the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve. So we did notice differences in the spatial variation of recruitment again. There were areas of exotic grass and a particularly large, nasty area of French broom, and the recruitment in those areas was less, again, giving rise to the concern that if there is an expansion of these non-native species or even native vegetation in shrub form, that we might still see reduced survivorship and establishment of the Santa Cruz cypress. Here, so you can just see it there's more examples of weedy, but the interior is pretty bare just because we're talking very thin soils. It's also on a slope here. And here's a couple little guys coming up through some exotic grasses. How am I doing for time? Who is okay. I guess we have a panel after this, so I can just ramble on indefinitely, and everyone's going to be like, oh my God, this guy's still going. I should leave. Okay. So Majors Creek. Again, we're getting close to the southern boundary now. The southern portion survived completely. The fire did not get there. There were about 30 trees in the northern portion left. We did have canopy cones. And the reason why I'm bringing that up repeatedly is because we think there's still seed in those cones. And so as we saw following the Martin fire, and I'll get to that a little bit more, we can still expect to see some germination from these cones that might have opened up during this fire event. But if there's just no cones there, the seeds fall into very thin soils, and if we do get a wet year, they could wash away, or maybe they're not viable after a few years. So when we see the canopy cones present, we're still hopeful that there is a seed bank there that can aid in the regeneration through time. So patchy and low recruitment, once again. Bested drainages. Possibly here we're seeing some effects on the north side of standing dead trees. Again, potentially a moisture issue. Rapidly establishing chaparral and knobcomb pine. And there's a little bit more anthropogenic activity here. So a fuel break, mountain bikes, depending on how the regeneration goes and the recruitment goes, these could be potential negative effects. But it's nice to know that it didn't just burn completely. It makes me feel a little bit better. And so these are the real quantitative results for bringing to make it apples to apples comparison. Everything haven't happened yet, but just Jodi, this is all work from, I forget, like 2011 or 13 is when the report was written. But so if the pictures are blurry, I apologize. It's because I was like snipping them from a PDF document and pasting them in. So just a refresher, though, that the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve in 2008, half of the mapped population burned with complete mortality. The recruitment following the burn was greatest near large diameter breast height trees. We're getting about 118 seedlings per 25 meter square plots. And this is higher than any observed response in the CZU lightning complex fire. The cohort density declined since time with burn, as you would expect, right? So if you have very high density of seedlings, not every single one of those seedlings can survive. We're talking about long-lived trees. And so you're going to have some natural mortality of your seedlings through time as the strongest ones survive. And that the burn promoted recruitment more than manual vegetation removal. This is something I forgot to mention, but there was an opportunity to do a manipulation to see if we manually remove vegetation, will that disturbance promote recruitment? And it did not do so as much as the actual burn. So the fire promoted germination more than the mechanical treatment. So our conclusions to date, again, we still have a couple more years of data to collect, but we are seeing recruitment, although it is low and patchy following the CZU lightning complex fire. It is much lower than what was observed during the 2008 Martin fire. So this one I feel like not super great about as far as like the long-term status assessment for the species. It's like, okay, well, I would like to see higher recruitment to make me a little bit more comfortable. And then follow it up with being it's much lower than this other event that we saw that also makes me pretty nervous. And then climate change, exotic species, and chaparral are potential barriers to establishment. Again, still I'm staying pretty nervous here. And then areas without remaining canopy cones may have less ability to reestablish. And so there is definitely a continued reason for concern and continued tracking, and we should be putting resources towards, if it looks like we're gonna have a hard time reestablishing, like what are the options available to us to ensure that we don't lose any of these populations, because like I said, there's only these 5 populations, and we would like to have them continue to persist. So the next steps are to do quantitative demographic monitoring in 2023, recensus the Martin fire plots, and remap stand boundaries in 2024, which will probably bring us right to the next 5-year review, which will occur in like 2025 or 2026. And then we can come back and have a discussion and hopefully be telling a really big success story. So I believe I would like to just thank you again to Jodi McGraw and the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, state parks, private landowners, and you all in the California Native Plant Society. Thank you. Yes, sir. I don't know. Should I just start answering questions, or should we wait?
Come on up. We're going to have all our speakers sit down in front, and we're going to pass around the microphones for those who have questions. And have a microphone for you guys.
Might just yell it at me.
I don't need the mic. So,
There's that.
Yes.
do you know how long the seeds live in the cones and on the ground? And do you know if there's impact from ash, heat, and results from the fire? Any of the chemicals that are being put out from the fire that are ending up in the soil and on the trees?
I don't think. Do you want to talk about this? Did you see fire suppressant or retardant or anything?
No, we would love to look at that, though. If there's anyone knows of any funding, we're looking to see. We actually collected some cones, and we're hoping to send them out to a lab and check on the viability. We heard from the other talk, Kyle Merriam's, that maybe viability is low in Baker cypress. So I'm kind of curious to see if our hopes of having this aerial seed bank that could drop more seed in subsequent, perhaps wetter rainfall years, is what our hope is. Maybe dashed if it's the case with Baker cypress that it's low viability. But we did see quite a few cone clusters with seed hanging on them, so I was hopeful that that maybe we could count on that for next year. Although we're going into another La Nina, which makes me very worried again.
So do you know how long they last, the seeds?
No, I don't think research hasn't been done for this species. So
But for the Baker cypress, she was saying just 1 or 2 years. So again, scary.
We're live. So this is for probably Alan. We're your neighbors down here in Irvine and trying to do similar fuel mod stuff. And you mentioned you go back, I think, 2 to 3 times per season. I'm just curious about that timing of trying to hit those non-native grasses coming up, and if you have like how your staff allocation works to make sure you're hitting that timing rate, so you're not getting the seeds going back in that whole timeline. So curious about that.
Yeah, so typically we'll do our first treatment. We'll go out 3 or 4 weeks after the first germinating rain of the season, and we'll assess all the areas and evaluate them for what's growing there and prioritize treatment. So our first pass of the season tends to be largely herbicide application to get those weeds while they're still small. Then, the timing is pretty weather dependent as to if there's a second flush of weeds or how much growth we have on the existing vegetation that needs trimming. And then typically we'll do our second or third, whatever, final pass. We try to have everything completed by the September, October 1st to be ready for the quote-unquote fire season, the traditional Santa Ana winds and stuff like that.
You have the funding to keep that going?
Yeah, we have funding. We actually set up, we get funded on a per acre basis. So all of our cost estimates are per acre, and we've got a rate sheet. And so however many acres the projects are, we just multiply that by, this is how many hours it's going to take us per acre for the maintenance phase, and that's how, how many hours we get to work on that project in that year. Yeah.
Start right here.
Thanks. Also, you're still standing, so I'll pick this question. What causes the home losses during the intense wildfires with those big? Is it just radiation, or is it like preheating from convection?
Yeah, so for instance, that coastal fire, the second fire I talked about, every single one of those houses burned because embers got into the attic vents. and those houses burned from the inside out. There were several houses that survived. All of those houses had been retrofitted with screens on their attics. That's what saved the houses. So that's a really important point, that, you know, the fuel modification zones are only one piece of the puzzle. The homeowners have to do their part in the defensible space around their houses, and you have to retrofit your houses. You know, some very small and inexpensive fixes can make huge differences in the survivability of the homes.
I guess then just obvious follow-up, is this going to help home loss in any way if there's still the ember-driven fires that's actually causing home loss rather than proximity?
Yeah, so it's a part of the puzzle. I'm assuming your question is the fuel modification going to help? Right, so what the fuel modification is designed to do is to slow down the spread of the fire. It's supposed to, the modeling shows that it'll slow down the spread and reduce the fire line intensity about 70% from untreated areas. So it's not necessarily intended to save every home. It's intended to slow things down so that people have more time to evacuate, and so firefighters have more room to get in and do their job. So possibly, maybe, I'm really, you know, I kind of, every fire season, I'm like, it sure would be nice if we could get a fire to burn into one of these areas and test it and see if it really works. But you didn't hear me say that. I'll deny it.
All right, question. You're still standing, Alan. When you work on private property, do you get...
Wave your hand.
Oh, right here.
Oh.
Sorry. Do you get waivers? Do you get contracts? Do you get permission? And do you also get like special requests? Don't do this, don't do that.
So for our grant-funded projects, for our initial treatments, we do need trespass agreements in place for our grantors. So that's a huge amount of work to go and you know, identify every property owner, and you know, we often go door to door and knocking, and nobody reads their mail in Laguna Beach anyways, so it can be a hard process to obtain those. And then, however, once they go into maintenance, we don't. At that point, we don't need to keep those. We don't have to need to go back. We don't have to keep track of home sales or anything like that. Just for the initial treatment. And yeah, we do a lot of special requests. You know, we maintain this patch of prostrate acacia because their neighbors are afraid that if we remove it, their hillside's going to slide down into their house, or somebody really likes this particular tree or something like that. So we really work with the homeowners. These treatments do go, you know, they cross property boundaries, so they're partially on personal private property, partially on city-owned open space, and we work with the homeowners so that they're comfortable with what we're doing. It's their houses, it's their yards, so they get final say on the portion on their property.
Thanks.
Quick question here about the cypress. Is that Butano Ridge picture?
Yep, that's Brackenbury, right? Brackenbury. No?
Okay.
Brackenbury.
And then the other question is about seeds and the longevity of the seeds. Are you seed banking from these groves now with seed or for seed?
So there are collections of this seed stored as part of, there was a North America conifer or seed collection event a while ago, and they were able to put seeds of all of the Western cypresses into the Calbot seed bank, and they do a really nice conservation collection there. But this project, Jodi was able to collect some seeds afterwards, but the goal for those is viability testing to better understand what that is, and not for banking at the moment.
We have some old seed from different groves. We'd be happy to try some experiments to see how they might do.
Look into that.
Okay, thanks. Alan, can you talk about your approach with the Coastal Commission for coastal development permit for this kind of work? In Marin, it may be that our local coastal program is super restrictive, but it's been an issue. Do you have a special approach to getting those permits?
I have one.
It's a lot of work, for sure. So the city hires several different consultants. Laguna Canyon Foundation does a lot of on-the-ground environmental design. We actually, map out the final boundaries of where all the stream buffers are and where the treatment area is. And then several other consultants come through. A biological technical report is created. Geotechnical reports, archaeopaleocultural reports are put together, and based on those, we design the final treatment. We work with a consultant. We work with Aspen Consultant to put together all of our CEQA and NEPA documentation, and we have developed a really great relationship with Coastal Commission, and that's a big part of what Laguna Canyon Foundation can bring to the table. Is Coastal Commission trusts us. We've been around a long time. We're a nonprofit. We're mission driven. If we put our a stamp of approval on it, that goes a long way. So
It's basically project by project.
it is project by project, but it's also about relationship building, and we've been working with the Coastal Commission. So the idea is that hopefully every project you put through is going to be a little bit easier. We're now currently working on one final coastal development permit that'll cover all of the rest of the areas that we need to kind of get it one and done. So hopefully that'll streamline the process a little bit.
Hi. I was wondering, is there any community science or citizen science programs or like SciStarter for people who want to become involved?
Is this a question for me about the...
I'm asking for the
Foundation,
Santa Cruz cypress. Sorry, Jodi.
Yeah, let's talk. I think we're going into I had an intern help out with the project this year from UC Berkeley, and I'm always looking for collaborators. So we don't have a formal program right now. We did build into the grant an outreach and education component too. We're going to share out the results, and so happy to entertain any ideas of people who might want to help out. It's tough work. I have to tell you that these are remote sites, and so the physical work is pretty grueling. But there's definitely, if you're into that kind of field work, then it's super awesome.
Great. I'll get in touch. Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions. I'm going over to Katie.
I have 2 quick questions for Jodi and Todd/Jodi. First, for the Erysimum, I'm just wondering about the natural history of the Sandhills. Could there have been a soil crust on the Sandhills prior to colonization and trampling that might have helped with the seed germination of the Erysimum?
There definitely are biotic crusts out there. You don't see them very often because there's so many impacts from people and probably wildlife too. But where you do see them, I don't know much about them ecologically. I'd be really interested in other people who could share more. But they're full of mosses and lichens and other cryptograms. And I noticed that where we do have the crust, you have a lot less exotic plant cover than when you don't have the crust. So I don't know what role they would have played in wallflower, though, so that's an interesting question right there.
Do you avoid those crust areas when you're tilling?
So the area that we treated did not have a visible crust. So the crust usually occurs in areas that don't have plant cover very much, kind of open sandy areas away from shrubs and trees. So I don't think that we had, we weren't wholesaling massive crusts. We definitely took out some native plants, though.
My second question was about the cypress. There's 2 varieties for the cypress. Did you notice any differences in how they responded to the fire?
Other than the sites probably had really different burn severity. So the butano cypress, like I said, Todd said, completely burned. Even in the open rock outcrop areas where there was very little fuel, where we saw prior to that, we saw the brackenberry population has similar conditions and plants persisted and could provide seed trees going forward. We had no survivorship at butano. I don't think that's because of the genetics as much as probably if you look look at the surrounding fuels and just the way it burned up that slope, it was probably just a very hot fire and centered over everything. I don't know that I could say anything from our first year's more recon level. We just basically mapped all the sampled seedlings and mapped surviving trees. I don't think anything jumped out at me that was linked to probably a genetic factor, though.
And there's no, I don't know if, I'm sorry if this is already widely known, but there's not like variety Abrahamsiana and variety Butanoensis at Butano. There's only Butanoensis, so there's no comparison, in situ comparison there.
Okay, we have one question we have left for today's session.
Yeah, this is a cypress question too. Considering, I guess under the federal regulatory theme, the two varieties are just considered in the same listing. But is there an argument to be made that since Butanoensis is a single site endemic, and that another fire during its kind of immaturity risk period could be not just a population loss, but like an extinction, if you believe that that variety is a good variety, which I think is pretty accepted. Like, is there any way that, is the recovery planning prioritizing that population at all, or is there an intention to do something about that?
So there is already a recovery plan, so we're not going to be writing a new one just for that variety. But I think, biologically, if you believe in that variety being a unique thing, then you are looking at an extinction if it doesn't recover. The federal government, as it stands currently, would not. That said, if we did see butano decline more rapidly than the other ones, like, I would be pushing to be like, well, we would be focusing on that, and we would probably be bringing this up as like, this is a genetically unique thing. One of the ways we evaluate threats to the species is, it's the government, there's always acronyms. We have the 3 R's, and it's resilience, redundancy, and representation. And the representation component of this is genetic representation. So this being a unique genetic portion of this broader taxa would be considered an important thing to consider. So it wouldn't get lost, but it wouldn't be recognized as an extinction of the species from a federal regulatory perspective.
Nonetheless, we'll be highly recommending a lot of active vegetation management around that stand in the light of what we saw with the Baker cypress. And we do not want to have another burn occur. This cypress didn't come up. This one starts reproducing in about 11 years. So we're on a very limited time frame to make sure we don't have, and there was a lot of fuel in there coming back from the chaparral. We definitely don't want another fire in there. So I'll be recommending that to Todd.
Hey, I said we would do it.
Well, this concludes our session. I'm so grateful that everyone had great questions and that so many people showed up. So thank you for coming.